welcome back. And today we're going to be having a bit of a chat about accreditation and what position does it occupy in the practice.
Is general practice in Australia under attack? There are a few people who think so. Welcome to the podcast by Scale My Clinic, founded by Doctors Todd Cameron and Sachin Patel, who are on a mission to help every general practice owner achieve his or her dream. The Scale My Clinic podcast is designed to leave listeners with insights and understanding gained by real lived experience that will help general practice owners create impact, get their time back, and enjoy increased revenue. Join Todd and Sachin every week as they share their stories on the Scale My Clinic podcast.
So one of the really interesting things that we come across a bit, Sachin, is we say to people, where would you like to get to growing your practice, or where would you like to get to upgrading your clinic? And as you and I know, that real question is, where would you like to get to upgrading yourself is often embedded in that. But often people say, well, I've got accreditation coming up in 3 months or 6 months, and so my attention is on that, and the team's attention is on that, and I don't want to distract from that process. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So accreditation, what is it? Accreditation is against standards set by our professional college, so Royal College of General Practitioners, and those standards have been very clearly set and they're regularly updated. Now, accreditation is a measurement and certification against those standards to make sure they're being met. Let's be 100% clear to start up with. This is not an aspirational, ANCAP 7-star rating or anything like that. This is really the baseline. So accreditation is not an aspirational standard. It's a basic standard and level of operation around safety and quality. And so we shouldn't really be overly concerned about wanting to be at a base level.
Overly excited by that.
Yeah. Because the issue here is that we should be aiming for aspirational high quality standards. If accreditation's all we've got to be aiming for, then we're probably setting the bar a bit low. So that's probably the first thing I'd say. The second is, it is, in my experience, overly blown up as a big deal in our minds. It is a big deal, don't get me wrong, but the amount of effort and energy and thought that goes into it is probably disproportionate to the outcome that we're going to receive. It's pretty hard to fail accreditation unless you have a business that doesn't meet the definition of general practice. If you meet the definition of general practice, then, and you're operating, with a degree of common sense, you're likely to meet accreditation. That doesn't mean you don't put the effort and energy into preparing yourself. Let's be clear, but let's not overblow what we're doing and over-egg it, because it's actually, when boiled down, a straightforward and simple process, and we just need to remember that and not let that be our guiding light, because before we know it, we might burn 6 months, a year of activity only on accreditation without doing any business improvement activity. And accreditation and business improvement, there's a minor overlap, but really the sorts of things we talk about and are talking about, Todd, are, way beyond, on another level, what accreditation affords us. And so it's really important that people don't mistake accreditation with business excellence, because they're not at all the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this is something that is deeply embedded in you from your time in the UK, but it is the RACGP that sets the standards in Australia.
Yeah.
Not the Royal College.
Sorry.
There is an Australian in there.
There you go.
But you're exactly right. It is essentially what we're talking about here is a minimum safety standard that people have to adhere to. At the moment, we're up to the 5th iteration of those standards. They continue to be improved and upgraded. And I'm going to ask you a question. Why do people do this? So we looked at the data, and there were, I lost my little bit of info here. We had 8,000 odd practices in total, 8,800, I think it was. 84 odd% of those are accredited. So we ended up with 6,800 clinics in Australia that are accredited practices. So why do those 84% of practices do it? And I wonder why the 16% choose not to do it. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I think we are, majority doctor owned, and so we like certificates. So I think that's one thing. There are, we also want to know we're meeting a basic standard, and I think it's actually really nice to have some defined guardrails to help us know what is considered appropriate and not. So I actually think that's really useful, and people would do it for that regardless. And then beyond that, of course, at the moment in Australian general practice, we are eligible to receive certain incentives on the basis of accreditation. So that's the practice improvement program and the now what was the PNIP, the WIP, the WIP. Those payments are tied to our accreditation status. Obviously, the initial first year after you register for accreditation, there's some in lieu incentives and allowances made for new practices or new registrants for accreditation. But once you're accredited, you are eligible for those incentives, and we can talk about those in another episode, of course. So they're probably the main reasons. I think some people may think that patients like it that I'm accredited. I'm not sure patients actually even know what that means. I think patients probably think if you're open, you're accredited. They probably don't know that. At the moment, you can just open a shop and off you go. I expect patients expect that you would have to go through some hoops to open a practice.
I agree. I think people often assume there are regulatory frameworks that are necessary to even be there. And that's an assumption made in a lot of sectors, not just in medicine, of course. So, what do you think the people are thinking that don't get accredited?
I reckon there's probably a few angles there. So there's probably certain niche businesses that aren't eligible to be considered at the moment as a definition of a general practice. So that's probably a significant proportion. But the others are potentially practices that have been around for a long time, solo practices, people who sort of just running it as a hobby.
They don't have the bandwidth, maybe.
It's just not worth it. And then there's probably a significant group that I've certainly had conversations with where they just put it in the too hard basket. It's not worth it. It's too much hassle. I'd rather just do my own thing. When actually, as we said at the beginning, it's not actually the big deal that we might think it is. It's relatively straightforward to go through as a process. They're probably the main reasons I think people don't do it.
And there's probably a couple of things that are worth saying here. I just want to add a little bit to what you're saying about the benefits of accreditation. Probably two more were being able to have GP registrars work in the clinic and medical students attend the clinic as well, if those things are important to you. The other thing that we want to be clear about is those 16% of practices that choose not to be accredited. We're not making any value judgment about that. And in fact, that could be tactically the right thing to do for you. And so, as you said, they fall into a range of reasons why they may not. But I think that often we have, when you and I were talking a bit about this earlier, we were talking about say CPAs or some standards have a well-known profile to them that is marketed to, whereas accredited practices, that's just not a thing. I don't think that if you went and grabbed 100 patients and said, tell me what an accredited general practice is, I think I'd just say, I'm not sure what you're talking about. General practice is general practice. So it really is an internal standard that we do for reasons of knowing that we have good systems and processes around safety, which is primarily the focus of accreditation, and that we have access to some government incentives as well. We talked a bit about it being a base standard. What are some of the things that you think that people get kind of sucked into thinking that it's more than a base standard? What happens in the minds of some people when owners, for example, or even GPs that are not owners, that they get sucked into thinking that this is something other than a base standard?
Yeah, so I think what happens, it becomes a central focus of everyone in the practice, and then people just start talking about it, and it's literally the only thing you'll hear about for months in some practices, especially early on in the ownership journey. And so almost by repeating the discussion around it, and it is important, so I'll say it once more, we're not trying to say it's not important, it's just that it gets disproportionate attention. And then you might get, because obviously part of accreditation is to produce and demonstrate policy and procedure manuals. And so then something that could actually be quite simple and straightforward, we overcomplicate. So the accreditation standards clearly tell us what the standards are, and that we need to demonstrate our policies and procedures meet those standards. However, people can get overly complicated with it and suddenly try to, write War and Peace around it, for example, when it doesn't have to be like that. It's there to meet a basic standard. Let's just make sure we've got processes that are solid and robust and meet those standards. And there are publicly available and offered template manuals that we can adapt, which just makes the whole process much faster. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other is there's perfectionist tendencies in our profession, with the healthcare profession, and so there's a level of standard that meets safety. In the pursuit of perfection, we've met the standard already. But in the pursuit of perfection, we then spend another triple or quadruple the amount of time on the same thing, thinking we're aiming for some perfect destination when that doesn't exist. I think there are perfectionist tendencies there. And the other is obviously fear of failure. So, the thought of failing accreditation, we are professional exam takers, the majority of us that are going to be in practice ownership. And so the thought that I could fail something,
it's terrifying.
That's what you hear. Yeah, it's what you hear about all the time. People saying, "Oh, what if I fail?"
Yeah.
Pretty hard to fail accreditation, actually fail.
Yeah.
Accreditation, and like I said before, it's pretty much if you don't qualify as a general practice, that's probably the most common reason for failing.
Yeah,
you hear about it.
You have time, as you say, to fix the non-conformers. I think you're right about the law of diminishing returns, right? And it's probably fool's gold in that people are seeking to perfect something that is imperfect by the nature of the fact that we work with humans and we are humans. It's going to make things a little bit more difficult. And one of the things that I think is emblematic of accreditation is the perfect row of policy and procedure manuals on the shelf in the clinic that when you open them, the pages are pristine. They have never, ever, ever been touched. And that is sometimes the issue, right? And what we see, so there's 3 weeks between accreditation and at the moment this changes over time. There are 5 bodies that do this, as you know, Sachin. And if you go to safetyandquality.com.au, you'll be able to see the full list of them. Because there are 5, this is no longer a duopoly. That means you are likely to get a better deal. And just remember, when you ask how much it costs to accredit your practice, there is one thing you should say after they give you the quote, and that is, Sachin,
please, can I have a discount?
Exactly. Take your best price and then just wait and see what happens, because these are up for negotiation like anything else. I think it's important that people have a focus here because of the 3-year gap. What we see is there's this idea that I've passed accreditation and now we can chill. And then kind of 6 to 12 months before the next accreditation, there's a spike in activity and anxiety around whatever the new standards might be. This needs to be embedded in just your daily, weekly, monthly activity, so as that if somebody knocked on your door and said we're accrediting you now, it really wouldn't make any difference. And getting to live and usable, not just documentation, but ideally your people using things like videos to demonstrate how to do a process or how to complete a task is going to be really, really useful. Some of the members we've got, use pretty cool tools for this, just to make sure that they engage the whole team in it. Because one of the problems with accreditation, of course, Sachin, is it's often, like one owner doctor, the practice manager, and the lead nurse. These three people build the whole thing. And so, whilst they love it, nobody else ever sees it. And that's the problem. So it needs to be really, this needs to be democratized and built by many hands and rebuilt and broken and rebuilt over time. And so, we often use Google Sites for this and a few other tools that just allow you to customize it, because the truth is that if you steal somebody else's documentation, it's almost never going to be appropriate for your environment. And if it's not appropriate, already getting people to read stuff is difficult in your practice. But if they actually do read it and think that bears no resemblance to what we do, then there's two harms there. The first thing is that your staff think it's bullshit. What you say you do is not what you do. And the second thing is they won't be engaging, contributing to it, because they're like, well, I don't know what the point is. It doesn't seem connected to what we do. So be mindful about what it is you're trying to achieve. In an ideal world, what I'm going to say is, in an ideal world, the key people in your business should be involved only in governance of this, not the actual doing of it. It should be done by all of the people that are at the coalface. This should be part of, that box we have in the framework that we use for prioritizing is called outcome delegation. If you can't get outcome delegation, and you had the two people away on holidays, the practice owner that's involved and the practice manager, and everybody said accreditation cannot take place until those two people are here, well, you've got some big problems. That would be the other thing that I'd add to this. Anything you think is valid to add before we finish up, Sachin?
No, I think just building on what you just said, there's just one thing to say, which is there are some practices where what happens on accreditation day is completely different to what happens the other 364 or 365 days of the year. That's not cool.
Yeah.
Right? The accreditation should be about what we do day in, day out. But what I would say is the way we actually do things should be at such a high level and standard that we don't even have to think about accreditation or will I get accredited. The levels at which we operate our clinics should just be so far removed from that base level that it's an afterthought, not the primary thought. That's where we want to get to. That should be the aspiration. Not meeting accreditation. It should just be blowing that standard out of the water with the level at which we operate. I think we shouldn't be under any illusion that the aspiration and the performance of the business should be so far ahead that accreditation could happen with your eyes shut.
And then what I can tell you is you can expect some really weird things in your review. So we did one recently, Sachin, and at the end they said, yeah, you did outstandingly well, at one of our clinics, and we passed. And they said, we noticed you don't have anything about bomb threats in your manual. I said, well, never had one, and it doesn't seem like something that's worth planning for, and surely we can work that out at the time. And natural disasters. Now we don't live we don't operate this clinic in a flood-prone zone, and there are not many hurricanes I can recall in Melbourne. I'm sure they can occur, and climate change could well bring about that. However, we were asked to include the way that we would manage such things in the manual. And the other thing that I think that is a useful reminder of is, if you think you can put everything into a process, you're just assuming you're going to employ morons and engage morons. And really, when we engage the right people in our organisations, in our clinics, the right people are people who actually have delegated authority to act and use their brains. And so, yes, you should always have processes, but you should leave scope for people to use their own thinking, because if you've got the right people, get out of their way and let them think. Don't just be dictating about how you do every single thing in the practice. I've fallen for that mistake myself, thinking you can process map everything and turn it into a document. It just isn't the way that any good business runs, I can tell you that much. So that may sound counter to what we've just talked about, but there is an inflection point at which, which you were talking about, at which it no longer serves you, and it could be harmful. So you've got to be aware about where that point is. That's important. Okay, I think that's probably where we should wind things up. So thank you for joining us today on this episode. As usual, I would love to hear your reflections on what was most useful for you today. And secondly, when you've thought about what was most useful for you in this episode, what is it that you are going to go and do that is different? Because it is only through action that you're going to change the way that you impact the world. Otherwise, scalers, that's it from Sachin and I. The rest you'll get in the blurb and the show notes. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning into the Scale My Clinic podcast with Todd and Sachin and the team. For more information and to get the resources mentioned in this podcast, visit www.scalemyclinic.com.